So we are delighted to have Derrick Jackson and Marvin Gundy here from the Sheriff's Office to tell you about a lot of the good things that are happening in Washtenaw County. So welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having us. So I think when I was asked the question around what's happening, kind of updates from the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, one of the first things that popped to mind is obviously our outreach team. So we'll talk a little bit about that, which Marv will help me talk about that because he runs that team. But specifically right now, where a lot of our attention is being paid to is the public safety and mental health millage that was passed recently, that now we're collecting the tax dollars on, and we're in the process of talking about how really to use those dollars around diversion work. So to me, that is one of the most exciting things that I get a chance to work on. I'm happy to answer questions on all kinds of other stuff. I seem to find myself in places like the One Community Initiative. So briefly on that, since you brought it up, we are in the process. Some of you were at the meeting. I remember some faces of hiring the equity officer for Washtenaw County, the first ever for Washtenaw County. So that process is still going through the hiring process, but there was a recommendation made to County Administrator Greg Deal, and so he's right in the midst of making some final decisions and then hopefully bringing someone on. So that means we will have an actual equity office here at the county. Question? What does the equity office do? Oh, it's a great question. What does the equity office do? Lots. I think, so some folks have the idea that eventually the equity office is going to have this large county-wide impact. And I think where I'm most concerned about is internally first. Right? There's all these internal policies around hiring practices, around promotional practices, around compensation packages. Every single decision that the County Board of Commissioners make could come through this equity lens. So this office would be the ones looking at those resolutions or looking at those policies that they're putting in place and saying, okay, how does this impact equity in Washtenaw County, positively or negatively, and then presenting that as a part of the board packet. So now every decision the County Board of Commissioners makes has that equity lens within it. So that's just a couple of the quick ways I think that would be looked at. So I think it's mostly internal to start. But of course, a lot of the departments and divisions and units within the county have large impacts on the county as a whole, right? As the citizens as a whole. So each department, division, or office is going to have their own equity plan. So things that each area would have to look at. And I think that that's where the larger county ripple effects will actually happen. So to me, that's a really powerful one. It's really good to kind of have that decision made and hopefully move it forward pretty soon. So, but I want to start with the millage. So feel free to stop and ask me questions about the millage. But the reason I want to start with this is, again, it's one of the more exciting things for me, and it's just happening. And so you may remember that there was this millage proposed to voters. It was passed last year, started being collected in this current tax season. So 8 years, approximately $16 million a year is what it's coming in. 38% of that goes to mental health, community mental health. 38% comes to the Sheriff's Office, law enforcement, diversion work. And then another 24% LUG is for the local units of government. So you know we have certain cities like Ipsy City, Saline, Ann Arbor, Pittsfield, that have their own police agencies. And so this is a mental health and public safety millage. So some of it is countywide, but some of this money goes specifically back to the local units of government. The county does not tell the local units of government how to spend that money. So these are kind of three distinct pots of money that were all rolled into one millage. The big overarching piece was around mental health, public safety, in particular, the intersections of those two around diversion out of the system. This is why it's so important, I think, and such a, huge thing for us in Washtenaw County. I was just talking to a counterpart from down south, and when I said that we have a public safety and mental health millage, that's all they wanted to talk about. Like, how do you actually have taxpayer dollars coming in to do diversion work specific and to focus on mental health and public safety? It's not a very common thing, definitely not in the state of Michigan, but even across the country. So I think it's cutting edge stuff. So it goes from 2019 to 2026. The mental health focus is really around crisis mitigation, stabilization, and prevention work. And I'll get into what we've done so far and what we're really planning to do in the long run. And the police services, so there is a portion of it's really focused on police services. And we'll talk about the new dispatch center, and some of it's going to go to that. But the other part, what I get to be involved in and I'm most excited about, is some of the future reentry work and diversion work. So prior to the millage, I'm going to split this into two pieces. There's all the community mental health stuff that they've been working on, and then there's all the sheriff's office, police services stuff. So I'm just going to focus on the sheriff's office stuff. And again, stop me to ask questions if you haven't.
So what community mental health funding has been to this point? Does it go on in the same way and there are additional dollars, or do these dollars sort of
Great question.
replace or?
Great question. So the budget for CMH, as I understand it, is still the same.
Okay.
These are additional dollars, right? And so they come into the CMH budget and funds.
So then, if the budget remains the same, these other dollars that they had before the millage go somewhere else?
No. The CMH
so
budget
it's
stays.
additional.
These are additional on top of that, right? Now, just to keep in mind, I'm not the expert on CMH, but there was such a lack of funding from coming from the state to community mental health around the state that there was a deficit running for community mental health.
Oh.
So this, in some ways, bolsters that, but also a lot of the work, and again, I'm not going to talk about all the specifics that they're working on, but there's some enhancements to their service. A really big part of what they want to do in the first year was really learn where to put those enhancements and do some public education, and then in the second year, really talk about here are the enhancements and what we're going to do. One of them is an assessment center, and we've been talking about this idea of what an assessment center would be, but in a nutshell, an assessment center is a lot of folks who are struggling with mental health crisis go to one or two places. Any guess of where those one or two places are in our county? Jail and
Emergency room.
emergency room, right? Both of them cost a lot of money. Both of them are not the best place for folks in immediate mental health crisis. What about that place outside of those systems? And in a nutshell, an assessment center can be that place. So that's not something that's been approved yet to do, but that's one of the ideas that people are talking about is, can families take someone somewhere before even having to call police or to call 911? Is there a place to go before it gets to a pretty severe crisis? So these are some of the conversations now that are realistic conversations for us to have because of the millage. And I'll talk about the diversion council and where those conversations are happening. So prior to the millage, what we were doing and what a part of my job allows me to do is work on some of these things. So the sheriff, I know he's my boss, but we're pretty lucky because he gets to travel around the country teaching other folks around how to do this work, but also learning. So one of the folks that he worked with had done some of this work in Boston, and kind of the premier way of training police officers on the road of how to identify a mental health crisis and deal with it appropriately, came back here to Washtenaw County, helped us build our training model, and now the Washtenaw County model is the recommended model for the entire state of Michigan, meaning that there's very few things that law enforcement by law is forced to do because of training. This is not the way it works in Michigan. So a lot of them are recommendations, but our training model for how you deal with the mental health crisis as a police officer is the recommended model for the entire state of Michigan. And so what that looks like, I should have pulled up the video. I'll just give you a story to really demonstrate the impact of this. So it's one thing to say we want training for folks to be able to do things, but there was one particular incident, it was really high profile about a year ago, so you may have seen it. A retired NFL football player who lives in our community is suffering from mental health challenge. He shows up to the auto parts store not far from here, and he's in the store acting really erratic, knocking things over, falling on the ground, getting up. So they call the police. Police show up. This huge, big football player of a man, right, comes out. And as the officer is engaging with them, he is not verbal. He's literally falling in the parking lot, getting up. He's going, rushing towards the deputy, backing up. Now you can see where someone who's, a 400-pound huge man, one officer rushing towards him, an officer may, without the training, pull a taser, pull a gun, use of force, and now we're on the news and something pretty dramatic and tragic, right? With the training, however, noticing that he's not verbal, he's not actually threatening towards me, although he's physically coming towards me. Yes, he's much larger than I, but I have a different context. I've been trained to notice what mental health issue there might be. And so I back up, I keep my distance, I try to work with them, but I keep my distance. And then you see the other officers coming. And when you watch the video, you see this training in action. And the wife in the news says, if this would have been in any other place, I'm afraid my husband would have been shot and killed. I use that as an example, pretty extreme one, but to me, that's real training that starts to change behavior when you give officers the skills. So I'm a social worker who became a police officer, and I just know that in the academy, you don't necessarily get trained in how to deal and recognize a mental health crisis. And so one of the more exciting things I think happening here is that we've already done that training for all of our staff. And the community mental health staff, actually we're doing ride-alongs with our staff in the patrol cars, learning about one another, developing training, co-teaching the training to all the officers. And now that training is offered to all the agencies in Washtenaw County. And many of them have already gone through that training as well. One other piece to layer on that, so everybody gets the basic training. The next piece is, you know how we have a SWAT team for the more serious stuff, right? Like a violent shooter or something like that. A deputy may show up as something really violent. They call a SWAT team and wait for the SWAT team to come. Well, the same thing we have now for mental health, right? Everybody has the basic stuff to respond, like I just explained, but we call it CIT, or our crisis intervention training, or crisis intervention team. Those officers have a little bit more training, and they're like the mental health SWAT team. So we can call them to show up to help deal with those more severe situations. And the third component that was added, and this was added by community mental health, they have a 24/7 crisis line. So our officers, who are officers responding to these calls on a regular basis, have a limited amount of skills on how to deal with it. So now there's a 24-hour number for them to call, and someone will immediately respond out to the door. So this is giving us more layers or tools in the tool belt to use, so the officers don't only have two options, psych ER or the jail. Now they have a multitude of options that they can use. So this is all done pre-millage. And there's some other things I'll talk about around how we're going to expand that. So there was a service expansion. I know some folks were interested in talking about reentry in the jail. The single most, I think, impressive thing that's going on in the jail right now is this. So we have totally redesigned, and I'll show you a slide at the end that kind of lays out all these pillars. But if you think about the rationale or the reasons of why people commit a crime or get incarcerated or fall a victim of the recidivism cycle, it comes to a couple of things. Housing or lack of, substance use disorder, mental or physical health, lack of education, lack of employment. And so when we start looking at those 5 things and start dealing with those 5 things in our jail, so yes, someone may still come to jail, but how do we assess what their real needs are? Everybody who comes into the jail. And then how do we get them connected to the right services? And then hopefully when they leave, they're in a better position because they're less likely to come back. So prior to the millage, we started putting this in place. And I'll just give you one example, the education setting now. Before, if you were a young person, 17, 18 years old, still in high school, you come to our jail, maybe you get continuing education services, but most likely you don't, right? You're disconnected from your high school, you're locked up. If you got a parent who really wants you to still get your homework, they bring it, but that's really it. What we did was totally revamp the system so everybody who gets booked into the jail gets an evaluation to see where they are educationally. No matter how old, young, where you graduated or didn't graduate, everybody gets this evaluation. And then from there, the WISD, Washington School District, has a person that works and is assigned to our jail to kind of manage all those individuals and find out how do we connect them based on where you all are in your educational life, connect them to the education if that's what they really need. And so now everyone's getting that piece and everyone's actually getting the services they need around education. And we've done the same thing for all of those different pillars. So this was, again, all done pre-millage. And then the care coordination is, when I was at Ozone House as a social worker, I wanted to work with the most vulnerable kids, and we thought we were, but really the most vulnerable kids are in the juvenile detention facility, right? And so now, knowing what I know now, if I could go back at Ozone House, I would be trying my best to get into the juvenile detention facility. So our interdisciplinary team has done that, has taken all of the experts from those communities, partners we have that work in those pillars of education, employment, housing, on and on and on, and now they sit around the table like this once a week talking about individual inmates when they're about to get released. You work in mental health, you work in education, you work in housing. I'm the inmate, I'm getting ready to be released in 60 days or less. Let's talk about what the plan is for Derrick. And Derrick's at the table to talk about that. And that's a pretty significant change that we have never had before. A lot of folks will say, you know, you've kind of seen it with NPRI in the prison system. Well, in the prison system, most of the time you know when someone's release date is going to be, right? And they're just there until that release date, right? Or until they get paroled. And the jail is different. I may be pretrial. I haven't even been sentenced yet. I'm sitting in jail for 30 days waiting for my court date, and then I have my court date and I'm out, right? And so reentry is a little bit trickier in jail than it is in prison, but that's where our outreach members and Marv's team comes in at, to really be engaging down in the jail in many different ways. So regardless of where and when someone's coming or going, we kind of have this really mobile ability to still attach ourselves to people. And then when people leave the jail, the really important thing is I can do great. We call it, you got your shine on. When I'm in jail, I'm incarcerated, and I'm sober, and I got my medication, and I'm feeling healthy, I'm doing everything right to get out. But then when I get out, and then I get dumped right back into the same neighborhood, community, family structures, right, we all know that. The impact that can have on folks to wind up right back in the system is real. And so where our outreach team comes in, and I'll talk about in a minute, is they really kind of help people to navigate that, to do those missions. So that's all the stuff that I think is good stuff that we've been working on really for the last 5 years prior to the millage. But there was limits on what we could really do within our current structure. So post-millage, what happened was the diversion council was formed. So I think this is important for people to know so that you know how to engage with or know who's making the decisions on what's going to be done with some of those millage dollars. So the diversion council is a combination, a consortium of people who work in mental health and law enforcement, sitting around the table. Right now what we're doing is looking at all the data. So we took the court system data, the jail data, and the mental health data, and we overlaid them. Basically created a data bank, and we started analyzing that data to find out some of the issues. One of the biggest issues that we notice is folks with mental health, yeah, they come in and out of the jail quite often, but they also stay longer in the jail. I don't have a quick answer of why that is. That's something we're looking into. Why is it more, if you have a mental health diagnosis, you're more likely to stay in the jail longer? I don't know yet, but it's one of the things we're trying to work on to figure out. And then we wanted to really identify some of the outcomes. What are the ultimate outcomes from the diversion dollars and the millage and then the diversion council? And really have that supported by the data that we've been analyzing. And then the final piece, like I said, was to have that data mine. So now the data is always going to be shared between the three. Between law enforcement and CMH, it's already there, and now we're just now adding in the courts. If I have my other presentation, I'd just say that I'll show you some of the data. Once we started looking at the jail data differently, we started asking different kinds of questions, right? One number I always throw out is like 85% of the people who are in the jail are from Washtenaw County. May not seem significant, but for us, you take that 85% plus the average length of stay is only 13 days. That means most of the people in our jail are from Washtenaw County and getting right back out and going to a neighborhood in Washtenaw County. So us doing this internal work really is impactful for us. Otherwise, our deputies on the road are just responding to the same houses, the same incidents over and over, the same victims over and over. So looking at this data, I think, is going to really help the entire system, even beyond just the sheriff's office and the jail, look differently at the problems we have in Washtenaw County around diversion reentry work. So here are the ultimate outcomes that the Diversion Council has come up with. So we want to focus on prevalence, recidivism, and length of stay. So we want to reduce the number of people in jail that have mental health or substance use disorder diagnoses. And so right now that rate increased from 24% in 2015 up to 29% in 2017. So it actually went up prior to us starting to do some of this work. The second one is to reduce the recidivism rate, people coming in and out of the jail around mental health and substance use disorder. So that rate in 2017 was 58% of people with mental health and substance use disorder came back, compared to the general population of 29%. That's a staggering difference.
How do you reduce the population of people in the jail with mental health issues, since the average stay is only 13 days?
So the average stay is 13 days, but you got to figure that we have a large population that just comes in, you know, like drunk or intoxicated, and they get right back out within 24 hours. But we have a large population that stays in the jail for much longer, right, up to a year and a half. So the average length is 13 days, but there are some folks that are staying in there much longer.
They're serving a sentence.
They're serving a sentence, or even if it's just one of the things around mental health that takes forever is while people are waiting for their psychiatrist to, you know, see if they're competent to stand trial. That's a long process. So they wind up in the jail for a very long time. So that length of stay gets driven up pretty significantly.
Is that money going to be applied to that problem? Because that's a real problem. When you ask for an assessment and it comes back a year and a half.
So I don't know how the money is going to be used, but I know this is one of the key topics that keeps coming up in the conversation, is really looking at that data. Why is it happening, and what can we do differently here in Washtenaw that isn't happening around the state of Michigan? So some of it is a state problem, right? It's the state system that does those assessments. And so there's some ideas floating around like how we can do that stuff here locally using the millage dollars to actually help us do that. But that's one of the key issues that has come up. So length of stay, so reducing the average length of stay, again, of people who are in jail. And this goes to your point. So this is why it's one of the 3 ultimate outcomes. And there's an additional focus layered on all of these that really is going to focus on economics and race. So, I always say that people are locked up in our jail because they're poor. I mean, there's some folks in there that aren't poor, that have, criminal stuff that they're being convicted of or sentenced for. But there's a lot of people who are sitting in our jail because of poverty. And so you see some disproportionality because of that, and particularly around mental health and stuff.
So does that mean if they could pay bail, they wouldn't be in jail?
Yes, for a lot of folks. Yep. Now they would pay bail. They'd be on the outside waiting until a trial. But there's a lot of folks who are sitting in their pre-trial because of bail. Mm-hmm.
So eliminating bail would solve that problem.
That's a topic for another discussion. But yes, it would solve part of that problem for sure.
Excuse me, I'm aware that several years ago, the hospitals and a variety of the community services agencies were focusing on people who use the services, who came into hospital emergency rooms frequently for economic reasons or mental health reasons or substance abuse reasons. Is any of the work that the group that you're involved with overlaying the work with this other group?
It's a great question. So I'll answer it in 2 ways. I will say, one, we're talking about the same people, right? The same folks that are going out of the jail are the same populations going in and out of the emergency room. So, so yes, in that way they're the same. I don't think there's been any real tangible yet connection between what the hospital systems are planning to do and what we are planning to do. Although that's another topic that keeps coming up over and over and over, is how do we overlap some of these conversations that are happening? Because the same, disproportionate cost that the emergency rooms have are what the jail has, right? And people go into the kind of wrong place when they need something else. So it hasn't happened yet, but it's one of the things that keeps being talked about.
Are you saying that it's not just the same characteristics, it's the very same people?
Well, I guess I would say some of it is definitely the same exact people, right? So if you look at our homeless population, right, we have the homeless population, they're in and out of the jail and they're in and out of the hospital ERs. So a lot of it is the same people, but it also, we're just talking about the same kinds of populations and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Other questions? All right, so just a couple more slides on the millage. So this is what it looks like. That was what we currently have been doing with the Diversion Council. So right now we're in the planning stages. All these ideas and great questions you've been asking are the same questions that we're hashing through and coming up with, okay, what's the recommendation going to be for this larger systemic change around diversion in our county? One example of what it may look like is around diversion in King County in Seattle. Some of you have been to our presentation on LEAD we've done before. So LEAD is potentially going to happen. I'll just say potentially because no decision has been made. But LEAD is one of those things that can really now get some momentum because now there's the financial ability to do some of that work. LEAD is law enforcement assisted diversion, and it is an officer and a social worker working together. You arrest someone or you come into contact with someone on the street for some of these minor, petty kinds of crimes. Instead of having to arrest them and take them to jail, there's a way to divert them. And that packet that goes to the prosecutor just sits on the prosecutor's desk. Never goes anywhere to court, never does anything as long as the person is doing what they're doing and getting the help that they need to get, right? And so in King County in Seattle, they've really found this is pretty significant in helping reduce that length of stay, who gets introduced into the system. And again, just because you have a file on the prosecutor's desk, if the prosecutor doesn't do anything with it, you don't have a charge. It's not in the court system. And so that's a pretty significant shift in a change. So those are some of the things that might be able to happen moving forward.
That's going to be a shift in the prosecutor's too.
Well, I think it's a shift systemically. It really is. It's a shift systemically in what we're trying to do.
Who oversees all that?
This is a part of it. So who oversees all of it? This is a part of the issue. There isn't one part of the system that has responsibility to oversee it. Now in King County, they all got together. So they sit in a room like this once a week. There's the public defender and the prosecuting attorney who assigned a prosecutor and assigned a public defender to this group to do this kind of work. It's actually housed under the public defender's office in King County. It was started by the chief of police. He basically was at this very contentious meeting around some racial disparities and how they were locking folks up, and he agreed, yep, we have disparities. And there was so much frustration, he says, and it's in their video, tell me what to do. And they developed this LEAD program out of that. It's one of the nation's best practice models right now. But it came out of a very contentious racial disproportionality of how they were arresting people and putting them in their jail for petty crimes.
Is the prosecutor's office currently involved in these plans?
Is our prosecutor's office? So yes and no, because we don't have, so LEAD is an idea.
Yeah.
Once the recommendation is there, then I think that's when, the rubber meets the road of like who's around the table to talk about, okay, is this something we're going to do? But yeah, we've been, folks have had conversations around, okay, here's the idea. We now are getting to the point where we can have some formalized recommendations of like, this is what we want to do. Mm-hmm.
Derrick,
Yes.
I'm sorry to be late, I just want to add another footnote. In Seattle, the prosecutor had it on his desk indefinitely with the understanding to not charge or until the next offense happened or until they just decided that statutes of limitation is about to run out, so I better charge it now.
No,
On the
it's a
used
great question.
terms from 16 to 19.
Yep.
We're seeing that currently.
So there's a case consultation with LEAD, and so off the top of my head, I'm not sure how long they keep it, but they really every week again revisit these cases and look at, okay, how is the person progressing through? Person gets their housing, person gets their job, whatever is kind of on their case consultation, then it goes away, basically. Mm-hmm.
If you were in charge of all this, I would have no fear. But this involves really such a shift in attitudes and propensities on behalf of so many people.
So I think we've been making that shift, though. He said it requires a shift. I think as a county, we've been slowly but surely, I've been here for 10 years, and I've seen slowly but surely the shift. Just look at our jail and the ability to do things differently in the jail. And now look at our outreach team and the ability to, so we hire some folks that have felonies in the sheriff's office. Well, guess what? That's not something the county traditionally is comfortable with. We ban the box, but try to get someone with a felony hired at the county, it's almost impossible, right? So I think some of it is slowly but surely shifting what people understand is what's possible and what's comfortable. So I do think because of some of the work we've done, because of some of the success, because the millage and voters spoke very just overwhelmingly, like this is what we want, and now there's these conversations to think about systematically how do you put it together, that I think was a fast forward to this slow but sure shift that's been happening over time. So you're right, it does take a shift, but I do think we've been making that shift. Every time I explain to folks what we are doing in Washtenaw County, primarily they wonder how we got CMH and law enforcement together. That doesn't happen in other areas. So just those two big entities itself, even if we didn't move to the full implementation of LEAD, we are diverting people from the system. I think when we start looking at the data, pretty significantly. We're actually helping folks who are already in the jail pretty significantly. So there are things we can do even within our span of control, but I think ultimately the Diversion Council wants to get these really large systemic changes. I thought I seen another hand pop up.
Well, it was me. Friends of Restorative Justice are finalizing an education presentation to do at town halls about what the prosecutor does. And what we want to end up with is a few concrete questions to ask the people who are running, the candidates for prosecutor. Do you think a reasonable question would be how would you respond to this kind of shift in lead?
So I guess I would word it a little bit different, not a specific question, but when people ask me around, I get this question all the time, what, we're going to hire a new chief, what should we be looking for? I go back to competencies. What are the competencies and the core values you want for certain leaders to have? And then to evaluate people on those particular competencies. So yes, what are their values, right? Like those kind of things. Like how it would, and you can maybe specifically ask about lead. I mean, that's really up to you. That might give you a lens into what someone's values may be around doing diversion kinds of work. But to me, it comes back, again, I'll speak particularly to law enforcement. When people are talking about a new chief or a new sheriff, I come back to competencies. And I've just based what I know off of what I see out of Jerry Clayton, to be honest, to be candid, right? What are the competencies I see in the leadership styles and the values that they have? And they aren't very different, just so you know, of the values that I think social workers have, right? The way we think about people and look at folks in redemption and all that kind of stuff. So that's the way that I would think about is what are the competencies we're looking for in leaders in different parts of the system. Yeah.
So the prosecutor told me that at some point he thought you had a very successful diversion program. But then he said that the budget was cut, and he was very disappointed because it was budget related.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could comment on that.
So I don't know, the diversion program that I'm aware of, I think was here a little bit before my time, so I don't know which was cut or not. But this is why I say again, I think now having the resources to do certain kinds of things takes that off the table, right? We have the resources, I think we gotta have the will, and then we gotta have the idea, but what to actually do is gonna have the biggest impact on our community for this particular work. Yeah.
And I would add to that I think another significant component is the system shift in their thinking about diversion, which of course will guide how you build your budget, right? So I think the diversion program is pre-me at the DRC, but what I've learned about it as we're diving into that pool again, there were just not enough system stakeholders lined up with that mindset about diversionary approaches.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's shifting now.
Yeah, I think it is shifting, and also when people say diversion, I think we should be really clear on what we mean. I think to have diversion in all levels of the system, if you lay the system out across linearly, so that officers can divert, but even prior to officer contact, what's the diversion? That's part of what lead is a little further up, so before they actually get charged, but there's even things that can happen prior to that. We have very limited options in our county of where folks, particularly with young people, it often gets said to me that I was referred, when my young person started having problems, I didn't know where to go, I was referred to the court. So it requires a family member to get into the system before you can actually have the resources and the tools to do anything about it. With 2,300 nonprofits and human services in our community, I think that's just downright tragedy. That you have to get into the system to really be connected to certain kinds of services. That's a outside of any other prosecutor or anything we're talking about here. That's really about what are the values in Washtenaw County, how do we identify that, and how do we really put things in place to divert young people or just people from the system in the first place. You'll also hear the sheriff sometimes even talks about we often in law enforcement get painted in this corner because we say yes to everything, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that people call 911 for a mental health crisis is another issue in our community, right? Not that our officers are responding poorly, we won't even go down that road. It's just the fact that the call has to come to law enforcement first before it goes to somewhere else. Like we should have something else in our community where someone could call around a mental health crisis. Then you don't even have to have the conversation around diverting from the system. They're getting the proper care they need from the very beginning. Last piece I'll say about that is we still do have the smallest jail per capita, right? So our jail is tiny for the number of people that we have in our county. So if nothing else, it forces us in Washtenaw County to think differently because it's not like if you build it, they're going to come. It's too small, right? We got to figure out who needs to really be there and who needs to be somewhere else getting the proper services that they need. So whether philosophically someone agrees with this work or not, financially and fundamentally, we don't have a large enough jail to keep locking people up in the ways that we have over the past. You remember all the court issues and stuff like that around the jail busing people to other counties and all that. That was because of jail overcrowding. There was just not enough space. When someone is in and out of our jail 6 or more times, it's not because they're violent. If you were violent and you were in and out of jail 6 or more times, you'd be going where?
Prison.
If you're out of our jail 6 or more times, you got all these other issues that we're talking about, around homelessness and addiction and stuff like that. So if we're really talking about dealing with those kinds of issues, the jail is not the place for that. There's things prior to that.
You just identified a real challenge of where the family is going to address, how they address a problem, and they have to go in the system. Is your group or whoever is designing what's coming up addressing that?
So part of CMH's thing around public education is some of this. So as we develop certain things, like so say we had an assessment center. The community, even with an assessment center, is still going to call 911, right? So some of that is public education. How do we shift the knowledge base to be like, okay, 911 isn't the first stop. The assessment center might be the first stop. That's a pretty big task to shift. Even we had this beautiful, nice assessment center building, people are just picking up 911 and calling the police for something that they think looks out of the ordinary. So I think it's going to, so yes, the quick answer is there are conversations, and some of the money initially for CMH now is this public education campaign that you'll start to see pretty soon around mental health stigma, but also around SUD work. So there is some stuff being done around that. I think as we develop what the answers or solutions are going to be, there'll have to be some more public education on, like, here's the service, here's how we use it, here's the shift in Washtenaw County.
What's happening in the summer of 2019?
So this is kind of more specifically, so this is after our future investments, right? So we're going to continue to do more training across the state, all extended to our corrections officers, the COs, so some of the same kind of mental health crisis awareness work being done with our corrections officers in the jail. De-escalation, so we're going to talk about integrating CMH into Metro Crisis Negotiating Team. So, the SWAT team shows up. We often, just because we do it the way we do it, we usually do call a CMH worker to come with us. But you can imagine a crisis negotiator sitting there talking to someone who's really struggling with mental health. You need a mental health professional right there. So we're going to formally integrate those things and establish this countywide crisis intervention team. So not just the sheriff's office one, but a countywide team that can respond out from a law enforcement perspective around mental health crisis. The version of summer 2019 is this. What we're talking about is a location in the jail. So there are going to still be some folks in the jail that have mental health diagnosis, and having a specific block, an observation unit, or a place to really deal with mental health inmates, right? So they're not just in general population, but we got some really trained professionals who can do that work in the jail, and actually having a shared funding with community mental health to have that person be both a sheriff's office employee and a CMH employee. Some of the other diversion work in the summer of 2019 is we have something that's similar to LEAD, but it's called CORE. And so now part of the millage is funding a diversion deputy. So a deputy at the deputy's level doing diversion work. So in some ways, think about it as funding a LEAD officer. So the officer that would be affiliated with LEAD, that's in the millage dollars for us to hire and staff somebody to do that diversion work. That won't actually, hopefully, if it's my way, we'll get it in the summer. If this comes in summer, we'll be selecting someone and doing some of that specific officer diversion work. We talked about the mental health unit down in the jail, youth prevention, doing some more crisis and stabilization work. So this is all future related stuff. I do want to just point out that this is still, some of the dollars are law enforcement in general. And so one of the biggest expenses right now is Metro Dispatch. So our dispatch center is housed in Ann Arbor City. We now dispatch for pretty much all of Washtenaw County. It keeps growing. So you see up there, yes, for the Sheriff's Office, Ann Arbor, Ypsi, Pittsfield, Northfield, Michigan State Police, which overwhelmingly is most of the calls in the county. So the size and staffing level has quickly outgrown the temporary space that was over in Ann Arbor. There's also all these technology pieces with all the new whatever it's called, the telecommunications stuff. All the technology behind the scenes is all, if a switch goes down, imagine a 911 center just going down, right? And so all of that technology is very, very old. So this is a lot of work is going into this. So this just talks specifically about and making sure people are aware, yes, we're doing a ton of diversion work, but some of that millage was specifically for general law enforcement kinds of stuff. So when people hear it, not for people to be shocked, like, well, wait a minute, I thought we were only doing this. There's still a lot that's going to be done around diversion work, but I wanted to point this out because this is one of the more significant law enforcement specific things that the millage is going to be used for. So last slide on this, took much longer than I thought I was going to take on the millage conversation, but this is what it looks like as far as reentry in the jail. If you think about, this is reentry services, these are the 6 pillars of kind of why people come back in and out of jail. Now, most of the research focuses on education, health, SUD, employment, and housing. We add cognitive behavioral stuff because if you think about addiction, right, sometimes there's some behavioral pieces to that, right? If you see someone smoking or you smell the smoke, you go right back into it. Some of it is also that around criminal behavior, right? You're living the lifestyle. You're addicted to certain kinds of lifestyle. So even if we have these abilities, people cognitively are still, as Marv calls it, stinking thinking, right? They're thinking, stinking wise, and so they kind of fall right back into that trap. So a lot of what we do really starts to help people think about, okay, cognitively, how are you thinking about your environment and the decisions that you're actually made? But this is the structure that now exists within the jail, specifically around reentry. So that anyone coming through is getting assessed in these 6 different areas, and then there's programs tied specifically to these 6 different areas. How many of you have volunteered in a jail before, or been in our jail before? So for years, we've been having programs in our jail. As a part of this process, we evaluated every program, no matter how much it costs, free, 20 years, 2 years, 2 days, and we said, all right, which ones are really working, which ones aren't, which ones feel good, which ones we probably should keep because it gives someone something positive to do, but really aren't attacking some of these things, and then we started changing slowly but surely the programming. So there's still tons of things for people to do in the jail, but all of it comes back to relating to these things. So anyone in the jail, whether you're there for a couple hours or you're there for a couple of months, you're hopefully getting a piece of this. So again, much longer than I was going to spend on the millage stuff, but I think it's important for people to know, and to me, it's one of the more exciting things. I don't know of another county that has a mental health and public safety millage in Michigan. So I think that was a pretty good thing. Any last questions on that part? All right, Marvin's going to help me with this because this is really Marv's baby. If you don't know Marvin Gundy, to my left, there's Marvin Gundy. Marvin's a rock star. The Pied Piper, I call him, because when you need a whole bunch of kids to show up somewhere, call Marv, and Marv will get the kids there. But Marv runs our street outreach team, so just jump in, Marv, whenever you want to. But our street outreach team was something that we started really 9 years ago now. And it really was taken from this concept that I learned at Ozone House when I was there. At Ozone House, we took young people who had been homeless or on the streets. We talked to them about the ozone services and the resources to help them keep themselves safe. And what we seen quickly was they turned around and gave that same information to their friends and families who they were under the bridges with, right? And so they did more kind of as the commercial or bullhorn of the Ozone House than I could have ever done. And so what we did was take that same model and bring it here to the sheriff's office, but to do it around criminal behavior, the criminal element, right? So originally when we started the outreach program, it was to reduce recidivism. Hire folks coming out of jail and prison, give them the resources and connections they need to kind of pull themselves together. They will naturally take those resources and give it back to their community and family members and help people to navigate the system. And the reason we did that was, a big part of our mission is to create public safety. I don't know how you build strong and sustainable communities or create public safety if you can't interact with a part of that criminal element that's, recidivating over and over and over, right? You have to have some relationship. And lots of folks don't want to have anything to do with the badge. So by having this relationship, the outreach workers are experts on community. Hands down, they are the experts on their neighborhoods and the community and what's going on in the neighborhoods and in the community. And so they really create a bridge that I don't think very many other police agencies have. You can actually talk to, learn from, hear from, teach this back and forth two-way street of communication thanks to the outreach workers. So Willie's one of our outreach workers, been here. How long have you been with us, Willie?
2.5.
2.5 years. And so Willie, feel free to jump in too. Willie's doing some great work with our peer-to-peer, which I'll talk about. And Marv, you've been here for how long?
Nah, I've been here for like 5 years in this position, but I was an outreach worker for a year and a half, so 6.5 years.
So here's what an outreach worker does. Outreach worker, they have some personal history, and that history doesn't have to be criminal history. It really doesn't. We're doing a lot of work around addiction. And then we've started hiring folks that are just good at this kind of work, right? Like they're just really good at knowing people and connecting with folks. So just because you see or hear someone has the title of outreach worker, don't make the assumption that, they got all these felonies in their background or they got this addiction history. Quite a few of our outreach workers have nothing like that. They're just still the experts, though, in the community. They're committed to using their personal story to help others, so there is a personal story component. They want to be like that example of like, you can make it. They're committed to self-improvement. Our outreach worker program is a program as much as it is a job, right? Really, they're getting paid, and you'll see why, to civically re-engage into society. And so they have a strong interpersonal connection and communication skills, and they're really the experts on the community, like I said. So they're not informants. So they work at the sheriff's office, but they don't work hand in hand with officers to be like undercover informants, right? Really what they do is help connect law enforcement and the community together. Yes, some people may want to turn themselves in, so they might run to Marv or Willie or myself and be like, look, I think I got a warrant. We get that on a regular basis, right? And so we can kind of help them navigate the system. That is much different than an officer coming to me and say, hey, do you have information on such and such? Yeah, we can go, do this raid on the house, so to speak. They don't help to arrest people, but they do help people to turn themselves in. They're connectors, not case managers. So they're not case managing folks, but they really are almost like a mentor side by side with someone as they walk through the systems. I always say to folks, at least to my officers, we work here. The outreach workers live here. So all the things that they care about, like they really care about, and in many cases they've lived through these things, right? So they're really passionate. When you talk about someone being homeless, we just had this the other night, didn't we, Marv? Someone's homeless. It's not like in some places where you can just go home and go to sleep when you know that that person is homeless. If you've been homeless and you know that person has nowhere to go and they just left our jail, like it hits you in a very different way. And so it keeps our organization connected in a very different way. That's what the outreach workers really do. I'm just going to skip through on a couple of these. Sorry, this is moving so slow. So what makes it unique is that we're embedded in a law enforcement agency, obviously. Most of the research around street outreach teams says do not embed within law enforcement. Why would you not embed within law enforcement?
Trust.
People automatically assume if you work with law enforcement, you're going to lose the community trust. We actually flip that upside down and say, nope, that's wrong. Because I have the connection to law enforcement to actually get tangible results. If I'm an outreach worker outside of the system and you have an issue, I can empathize with you, I can walk hand in hand with you, but there's a limit of what I can actually do. Now, if I'm inside, we start to develop a relationship. You know that really what my role is. I can tangibly help walk you through the system. You can see some accomplishments from that. Now you start to really feel like, whoa, wait a minute. Those outreach workers are really about that business. The other ones are walking hand in hand with us. There's a different level of connection there. And so what we've seen is, yeah, some people may be questionable, like, can I really trust this? But once they get connected, once you talk to Willie or talk to Central or talk to Marv in the jail, they understand what's really possible. And then the other one is we focus on the individual, not just on the community impact. Most outreach teams focus on these large, like, reduce gang violence in the county. That'd be great if we could, but that's almost impossible for one small group of people to, reduce these larger systemic things. But we focus on the individual. Is the outreach worker healthy in all these different pillars of ways? And if so, then that's success for us. And I'll show you some of the success numbers moving forward. But here's our goals: reduce recidivism, resource communities, and enhance problem-oriented policing. So there's this connection between reentry in the jail and the road patrol and our outreach workers. I'll give you a quick example. Our SURE Moms group that some of you know about, Sisters United, Resilient, and Empowered. They're a group of moms. It's a support group. Believe it or not, it's a support group run by the sheriff's office, the outreach team, of moms who have kids involved in the juvenile justice system. You have an officer, a CMH worker, and an outreach worker sitting around the table with these group of moms. And I'm just going to say that it's the most powerful thing that I've seen in a long, long time, where you can have these moms and their relationships dealing with some of their own personal trauma, but in particular the relationship they have with the deputy. And so when the deputy deals with their kid on the street, there's a whole different dynamic than what it used to be. Or when that mom knows something is going on in the neighborhood and they call that deputy before something pops off, that's a whole different relationship in a way for the mom to be connected with law enforcement. And so these relationships and some of these kind of enhancement things are real tangible, right? The deputies feel safer, they understand the community better, the community feels safer, they understand the road patrol better, and now they have a relationship. So when I go home and go to sleep and I'm not at the meeting, guess what happens? That officer and that individual who meet at 2 in the morning, they have a smooth relationship. I don't have to be the mediator, right? They're kind of taking care of it themselves. So, real quick, the civic engagement model. So this is the science behind why we do what we do. When you get arrested or when you're in long-term addiction, you get disengaged and disconnected civically. right? You go to jail, it's hard for you to get a job, hard to get an apartment. Sometimes your voting rights are taken, can't get public assistance, can't get loans to get into college. You really get disengaged civically. So that's a part of why people recidivate. I can't get a job, I can't get housing, I gotta survive, right? So what we started doing was, how do we help people re-engage civically? How do we help them get their lives back together, get their jobs together, get their license, get, housing and all those things. And once they re-engage and become a part of civic society again, the things that we take for granted, the kind of the safety net for us to keep us on the right path, once they re-engage and have that, they are so less likely to ever reoffend. That's the pieces they were missing in the first place. So the long-winded science behind it is we do all these things to kind of weaken those barriers for them to engage civically. That's really what the program is. And I would say, and I would argue, that's really what a lot of reentry programs need, is to help people re-engage civically. So, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of embarrassment when someone is in long-term addiction or when they've been incarcerated. So when you come out and you feel shameful, like it's really even hard just to go talk to someone eye to eye or face to face and talk about a job. Or when you keep getting rejected because you got something on your record over and over and over, that's hard for any of us, let alone someone who kind of has some of that baggage. So we really work through that stuff. And that's what Marv, quite honestly, is so good at, is like helping people walk through that process over and over and over. Just a couple of more. So peer-to-peer. So I talked about Sure, which is our next slide, but peer-to-peer is one that Willie runs. And Willie, so jump on in, Will. But Will runs the peer-to-peer program. It is, in essence, folks coming out of prison who are on felony probation. The rate of them violating and going back to prison was so high, the state was spending so much money. They seen what we were doing with our outreach team, and they said, hey, Willie, can you take these guys and ladies that are coming out who are on felony probation, can you pair them up with a peer mentor? And can you help them stay on the right path? It's almost like a big brother, big sister program, but for people on felony probation. And that's really what Willie, who's an outreach worker who runs that program. Anything you would add to that, Will? Like what you guys do or what it looks like?
There's people coming in there that have no idea what they're going to do next. So I help them find employment, help them get the resources to get housing, help them get their grades, cards, ID. Just help them get all the resources they need to have in the community to succeed.
Do you do anything with trying to reestablish their relationship with their stillborn, with their family?
Yes, we talk about that, and if they want to have a one-on-one with their parent, come in and we sit down and talk, and I just sit there with the mediator while we discuss the situation that's going on. And most of the people are starting to get better relationships with their family members. So they've lost a lot of trust with their criminal behavior, how they're coming out of criminal behavior, and family are starting to trust them more.
And he used a key word that I think is relevant to you all, is those mediation skills. He's gone through and been trained by Belinda, but I think those come in very handy when you're talking about, if you guys have done some of them, right? Those are really tough discussions and conversations to be able to have, to kind of repair some of those broken relationships. And sometimes those relationships have been broken over years, right? The person is in recovery, they get active addiction, they're stealing from parents are, all kind of self-blame. So there's a lot of things tied up in that really helps walk people through.
I was under the understanding that ex-felons are not supposed to be contacting ex-felons when they're come out of prison.
You want to speak to that one? That's very true.
Yeah, it's awesome. You see how we're breaking down the barriers? That's something that it's like an underlying, I think it's like an underlying truth. It goes on all the time, but it is actually not supposed to happen when they're under supervision. They're not supposed to be around other, I guess you could say, like-minded individuals. But we have broken that barrier because the state, we do it all the time, and they haven't brought it up as an issue. And we brought it up in some of the conversations with community corrections, and it hasn't been an issue. I don't think we've touched on any of the laws and any of that nature, but just the fact that we're allowed to build and create in that environment with all felons in the room, just to prove that it's something that shouldn't, it's a barrier as opposed to something that's good. That's awesome what's coming out of it. And we've been doing it for the last 2 or 3 years, and it's actually been great for us to have that peer model, like Willie said.
It seems wonderful to have it, but that doesn't threaten a person's parole?
No.
So there's two pieces to it. I'll just to add to what Barbara said is, so for our outreach program and outreach workers, we often wind up talking to the parole officer and probation officer, so that they are very much aware, right? It's a part of getting hired. So it's a clearance on that side. I will say for this program, the parole officers are referring them to Willie. So it's a part of, oh yeah, so you know, they know that this peer mentor would be a really good resource for this individual. So it's funded by the state. The state is what pays for the program through the Michigan Department of Corrections, and it's their agents that are referring folks to our program. Now, Willie has to do a lot of recruitment and going out there and say, hey, here's the program, it might be good, but ultimately, technically, it's them referring to us. And I will say that it started out as a pilot. They heard what we were doing with the outreach team, and they seen the success rate, and they said, whoa, wait a minute. Could we in some ways use your outreach team to do this work? So 3 years ago, it really was just a pilot to test it. It got refunded to continue to do it. Technically, it sits under community correction, so it's a alternative to incarceration program that gets funded by the state into our community corrections budget, and it's their outreach workers who do that work. The other way that the state has really tried to mitigate that felons not being around felons is that our mentors have to be 5 years out of any sanctions, meaning I've been 5 years off of probation myself or parole myself before I can, do some of this mentoring work. Now that's creates some issues because some of our best potential mentors may have only been out for 3 years, 2 years, or maybe even only a year. So it does limit us, but I think from the state's perspective, that gives some kind of leeway to be like, yep, you're 5 years free and clear of any sanctions before you can actually officially be a peer-to-peer mentor.
Are there women peer mentors who aren't currently mentoring women who are being released from Huron Valley?
So Centra, who had to step out, is one of our newer outreach workers who's in training to be one of the women peer mentors. We had Jeanette Haddon, who was another peer mentor who was kind of helping out. There are definitely women in the peer-to-peer group, correct?
We have Monica Gibbons. She's an actual resident from Huron Valley who is in the hiring process right now.
Who is that? I missed the first
Monica Gibbons.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So she's in the process of
To become one.
kind of the I get to know you, you get to know me process before we even go to the next step. But she is actually very adamant in getting services for the women out there. A lot of her friends are still in or have gotten out, so she's in touch with them a lot.
And she's been out more than 5 years?
Monica has been out for a while. I'm not sure if she'll be able to be a mentor in Willie's group, but being an outreach worker, we still are on that thin line of who we see and who we don't see. So
Right.
Yeah.
she'll be able to help out.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. That's so good to hear.
Yes, ma'am.
So the last slide I'll just show in this, and then maybe ask Mark to kind of share some of his perspectives on the outreach team as a general. In general, so when we look at the success rates, these are the ways that we measure success. Now remember, these are for outreach workers specifically. So all the outreach workers that have come through the program, 94% of them go on to sustainable employment, meaning it's only a year to a year and a half program, right? It's a part-time job. It's really to help people reconnect civically and then jump off. If we allow folks and we paid them well, they would stay here. Because one, we gave them an opportunity when most other folks didn't give them an opportunity. So partly why we keep it part-time and then have them jump off is because once they get to a certain point, they're ready to go off and work on their own. The next person comes in. So 94% go to sustainable employment, 88%. So it's not 100%, right? Some folks relapse. Some people go back in. We had a young lady who was in our hiring process who overdosed and died. We had one of our other outreach workers who overdosed. So it isn't, a panacea like it's perfect. But I think these numbers are much better than what they would be if it wasn't a program like this. Most folks go into sustainable housing, and what I will say is the employment and housing, those go hand in hand. So what you often see is once they get the stable employment, they can afford to keep the stable housing. And then 71%, we used to measure educational attainment when we started this around high school or graduation or GED. We're thinking that folks were going to just be getting their GED. What we quickly found was that 71% is higher education. So folks are very intelligent, right? Folks are smart folks. They really have high aspirations for themselves. We actually help reconnect them. Most of them turn out wanting to be social workers, but they go back into school, into college, community college or at Eastern primarily is where most of them have been. But 71% is pretty significant. It's about $46,000, $47,000 a year to stay in our jail. If you had a jail bed for a year, roughly $10,000 a year for an outreach worker. So if I can do with $10,000 a person versus $47,000 a person, with this success rate versus on average around 63% of the folks in our jail come back into our jail, that's a pretty significant turnaround. So the program works. I will say it's very intensive. So Marv is spending all day, every day with outreach workers and making sure we pick the right folks and they're getting the right training. And so it's pretty intensive, and the group stays fairly small, 6 to 7 people. But I would like to argue that it works. So when I was asked what are some of the really cool things happening in Washtenaw County, I love to talk about this one because it has so many ripple effects. And again, it's a smaller group of individuals, but they're having some pretty substantial changes in people's lives that you can actually see. Yeah.
So what is the size of the, well, maybe it's even hard to say, but how many folks are you working with at any given time, an average?
For outreach workers specifically, who we hire is like 6 to 7. How many people are you guys working with across the county?
I think so. It's like remember that it's like the chain letter, like the chain effect. Like we may work with 3 people, but the work we do, like that's my man Anthony over there, a buddy of mine. Me and Ant doing some work, and Ant may be working with 2 or 3 people from the trickle-down effects of the knowledge that we didn't have, and that now I have from working with Mr. Jackson in the sheriff's office. So I'm just trickling it down to other individuals who are going to help others. So that kind of system is what it's a lot of people. At the end of the year, we help literally thousands of people, because you can think just the decision on where to go get some free furniture when you don't have none and you have little kids at home could turn into a month issue, or it could be 2 or 3 days. So something like that could be a barrier for other things. So just those trickle-down effects, to me, that's called helping, steer somebody in the right direction. So that's some form of case management for us. And that happens on a daily basis as we walk in and out. We're right next to community corrections. So as we walk out, we see individuals who are supervision all day. So
Yeah.
a lot of people.
So there is a lot of folks. I will say that Willie and Marv in particular go down into the jail. So a lot of Willie's outreach work happens in the jail specifically. But for some other folks, they're out in community. Centra talked about her neighborhood, so she's doing a lot of work in the neighborhood specifically. So there's a lot of different ways that people get engaged. Like once they're an outreach worker, whatever their passion and skill set is kind of the area that they navigate to. Again, all tied back to those pillars around substance use disorder, mental health. So someone who comes to us because they've struggled with mental health, they're going to be most likely working in the mental health field. A couple other quick little tidbits. One of the favorite things that I love that we do is we get to teach the residents at St. Joe's Hospital, all the potential doctors. We do this once or twice a year where they're all come together in a room. We get to train them. So the outreach workers get to talk about their stories, but then share individually, kind of in a small group setting, like what would it be like to be an addict who is in crisis, and I come to the emergency room, and you're the new doctor dealing with me. And you should just see some of the back and forth conversations, right? So these new doctors are like, well, I care about addiction, but I don't want you to take advantage of me, and I'm giving you opiate, this back and forth. And there's just some real stories that get to happen. So you can imagine that's just one thing that the outreach workers get to do, but they're having tremendous ripple effect on all those residents' minds as they start to grow and to be doctors and move off across the county and across the state and country. So we do a lot of things like that to just help people connect and learn around destigmatizing some of the stuff that's been going on in our community.
Do you have a veterans outreach?
We do not specifically, although we've had 2 veterans come through, and so we have a relationship with the county veteran organization, but we haven't really done a specific outreach component, not through the outreach program yet.
But we work hand in hand with a lot of the organizations that we refer the veterans to. And see, that's a great thing about the program is we're a serious referral program. We visit all of these nonprofits in the county on the sheriff's behalf, representing the sheriff and the community. And since we see all the individuals who's coming in and out of the jails, we act as the liaison for all of these organizations. So we get thanks and praise all the time through barrier busters, through individuals, through other organizations, because we don't have the funds and things, this is county dollars, but those organizations do, and we know them firsthand, so we send people there by the boatloads, whether it's Dress for Success, whether it's the Kiwanis Club in Ann Arbor, House by the Side of the Road, whether it's bus tickets, the list goes on and on. Educational services throughout, areas. So we are actually the advocates for those services. I think that's a big thing about the program.
So, I have a ton of other stuff that I'm always excited about in Washtenaw County, but those are two of the biggest that I wanted to bring here that I think continue to evolve and change. And you hear different programs coming from the sheriff's office like SURE and peer-to-peer, but a lot of that really gets run by these folks. So you get to hear me talk about it, but it's really, I talk so much that I can't even do some of the work, right? It's like, they're the people who are really, really doing it. So to acknowledge them. And then the other one, obviously, I think to pay attention and get engaged in some of the diversion conversations that are happening, because I think some of that work has the potential to be pretty significant for Washtenaw County. So thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Just wondering how, as a community member of Washtenaw County, apart from paying our increased taxes, which mine's already started and I haven't paid, how can we support this initiative? What can we do?
How can you support? I think a couple of things. One, as you hear some of the recommendations to come out. So CMAC is, I don't even know what the acronym stands for, but it was the Community Mental Health part that recommended to the County Board of Commissioners how they were going to use those CMH dollars, right? So when you hear those recommendations or you see them go to the board, to really get engaged and pay attention to that. So when you hear diversion or public safety and mental health millage and you see those recommendations going to the County Board of Commissioners, to pay attention to that. I think one other way, remember that the local units of government are also getting a pot of the money. And so even in your own cities or townships where you have your own police agencies, to really find out, wait a minute, City Council, how are you planning to use those dollars? And just get engaged in that conversation around how those dollars are going to be used. I know Ann Arbor's been having some conversations, so has the city of Ypsilanti. I don't personally know how they plan on using those, but I just know that the local units are also having some of those conversations. So just
accountability.
Accountability, but just to be aware, I mean, and to give ideas. I think for us, it's good to hear feedback. Every time we did some of those community sessions, there were folks, like conversations like this, were asking really good questions to make us think like, that is a good idea. Here's how we should do. There's some of you around this table that always ask me about LEAD, and that's good because then I can always go back and say, we need to really do LEAD. So I think some of it is just that.
Okay, thank you.
Have the allocations been made?
Allocation's been made. Yes, yep. So if you go back, and I can't even remember, so the county budget has been set, and as a part of the county budget, the millage process and those millage allocation dollars were set in that. All righty. So thank you all.
Thank
you for the invitation.